Wouldn't recognize the turn even if I seen it. Been driving all along, feel like I'm dreaming. Okay.
How we doing, y'all? This is Vocab Malone. Welcome to Street Apologists Live. This is the show where we serve the underserved and look into the overlooked. And we're definitely going to do that today. I'm very excited about today's program. I think you guys will be too once you see what we're going to get into, talking to Dr. Louis DeCaro. And I've got a few of his books here. We're not going to be talking too much about this one, but this one I think is a must for every Christian apologist to have. Malcolm and the Cross, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and Christianity. Very unique book. And let me show you two more of his. I got one on Kindle, so I can't show you that. Well, I could, but I'm not going to hold that up. I got John Brown, The Cost of Freedom. Great cover. Even my son liked that cover. And then probably my favorite one from the Fire from the Midst of You, because it deals with the religious life of John Brown. And that is a lot what we're going to be talking about today. And again, very excited. I do want to know how you all are doing. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button. Make sure that you hit the like button. You know, all these important buttons to hit. You guys know what to do. Make sure you hit them all. And let me make sure I got everything set up here. I'm always worried before I hit the buttons. Okay, I think I am good. Okay, Dr. Louis DeCaro Jr. is an ordained minister. He's an adjunct professor at Alliance Theological Seminary, New York campus, and a ministry affiliate of the Latino Pastoral Action Center of the Bronx. He resides in New York City with his wife, Michele Sweeting. Welcome to the program today. Please, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Louis DeCaro. How you doing? Come on in. 3, 2, 1. We're there. I'll give you a little bit of a applause here.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent. So, you've had a busy day, haven't you?
Yes, it's been a busy day indeed.
I'm glad you could make it on, though. I'm glad you're able to do it. It's funny because I emailed you 3 years ago. You responded, I forgot about it. Mm-hmm. And then I saw my email and I said, I better get back to him.
Yeah.
So
well, everything in time, so that's fine. Yes.
3 years in the making, this interview, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just start out right from the gate. We're talking about John Brown. They don't all know him, but they're going to get to know him today. First question I want to ask you is, did he start the Civil War?
Well, you know, people like to make those stylizations. I would say that the Civil War was a process that was taking place. John Brown was a major player. I think it's been a tendency for historians in the past to say he was the spark. But the reality is the circumstances that led to the Civil War were already in play. Even if you go back to Kansas in 1856, the war had really started unofficially in Kansas. It's just that the North wasn't fighting, and John Brown was the first anti-slavery person to throw down, so to speak. So in that sense, he did. But in another sense, we could say slavery started the war, that slaveholders started the war, because you can even go back 10 years before Harpers Ferry, and there were already talking in Virginia, in South Carolina. There were a lot of slaveholders who wanted to secede from the Union 10 years before they did. So what started the Civil War is the greed of slaveholders, and the people that tried to prevent it the most were the people making money in the North. So,
Excellent answer. And we have people excited for today's interview. Purely Grounded says, I'm excited to learn who this guy is, and you will today. We've got really the world's foremost expert on the topic, and I don't just say that lightly. It's no joke. Bain Mailer says, lived in Lawrence, Kansas for a decade. Love the topic of John Brown. Excellent. Well, we got a good audience then today. Okay, let's quickly debunk. Take your pick. 2 Southern myths about John Brown. You have a whole blog post on this topic, debunking myths, really Southern myths about John Brown, but they've leaked over into mainstream society in many ways. Let's debunk two myths about John Brown.
Okay, very quickly, probably my favorite one to attack is that he did not, speaking of attacks, he didn't attack Harpers Ferry to seize the weapons and start an insurrection. By his own statements, John Brown was not interested in the weapons. There's no evidence that he went for the weapons. There's no evidence that he removed the weapons from Harper's Ferry while he occupied the armory, the federal armory there in that city, which in that time was still in the state of Virginia. So I don't believe that he was there. I believe he was using it for a political statement, and maybe you don't have the time to get into it, but it was really a political statement about the liberties that the South had taken with federal property. And so he decided to recenter his plan, which preceded the Harper's Ferry raid. He wanted to do a liberation movement into the South, but adding on Harper's Ferry. So that's one thing. I don't believe that he was interested in the weapons, and I don't think he was an insurrectionist. An insurrectionist, by definition, in terms of slavery, an insurrectionist kills slaveholders, has the intention of killing slaveholders for the purpose of being set free. Spartacus was an insurrectionist. Nat Turner was an insurrectionist. And I'm not saying I think Nat Turner was wrong, but or that Spartacus was wrong for that matter. But John Brown himself did not want to conduct a war against slaveholders. He wanted to conduct a war against slavery, and he wanted to use minimal violence, but at the same time, he did not believe he could do it without some form of active force. And so he denied being insurrectionist. No one takes him seriously because the South had to call him an insurrectionist and had to accuse him of trying to steal weapons to foment insurrection. And I don't think that either of those things are true. I've written about them extensively, but I don't think that they are true.
Is it true he wanted to arm the slaves with pikes?
Pikes, yes.
Why pikes?
Well, pikes were more of a defensive weapon. They were long poles with a kind of really modeled on a Bowie knife, a spear, a sharp blade. The purpose was he intended to break the people he set free. He wanted to have them in cadres. They would be largely working through the mountain system that stretched all the way down into the deep South and all the way up into New England. And they would need that weapon to protect themselves from wild animals. They would also need that weapon for any sort of hand-to-hand combat or any. They would not be fighting in pitched battles on a battlefield. They'd be encountering maybe people pursuing them with guns. This would give them an advantage. Plus, they would be with people who had weapons. And the idea was, as the movement progressed into the South, as many as they could get north, they would do that by way of the mountain system. But at the same time, they would be building teams of people who would come down from the mountains, liberate people, retreat to the mountains. And this would be an ongoing thing that would essentially collapse the whole system of slavery. John Brown wanted to destroy the viability of slavery in the South. He did not want to massacre slaveholders.
Is it true that he essentially wanted to terrorize slavers? And so is there a sense in which you could call him a good terrorist? I got a book with that very title, not your book, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think I reviewed that book in my podcast. Don't like that book, but I would never acknowledge him being a good terrorist, because to me, terrorism is fundamentally, it's a negative thing. It's certainly not appropriate for a Christian. Again, I think he wanted to introduce instability. Again, terror would mean he would be causing slaveholders to be afraid for their lives. And again, that wasn't his intention. What he wanted to do was create panic and instability, economic instability, because the point was to lead off as many people without ever contacting slaveholders, to lead them away and create a ruckus and an uproar in the operations of the South. If people wake up and their slaves are gone, and then what he thought they would do is they would start selling their slaves deeper into the South to try to salvage whatever profit they could. Because remember, Black people were treated as they were just property in their eyes. That's essentially the bottom line. And so he wanted to disrupt the system of slavery, as James Redpath said, from Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico. And had he been able to actually start this system, he would have created a lot of disruption. The terror part, well, sometimes people who are guilty are going to see enemies over their shoulders or in the shadows, but he was not a terrorist in that sense.
Yeah, and also he didn't target women and children for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. No, he didn't do that. He didn't. He didn't. He never killed anybody, and the number of people he killed is actually very small, and always in a combative or a guerrilla context. But there was no such thing as collateral damage for John Brown. Terrorists always uh, attack innocent people for the purpose of creating terror. John Brown never did that.
I know you don't necessarily like the book, and I could see why you wouldn't after listening to a lot of your stuff. But I did think it was interesting on page 119. There's this little map recreated, and the idea is these are the states that Brown was going to target using the Appalachian Mountains after Virginia, and which is where Harpers Ferry was at the time, everyone, which Dr. DeCaro has pointed out. And the idea is, go to these other places after that, one by one, using the Appalachians as a base. I saw a little dramatization where he was talking to Douglas, and he said something in relationship, I believe, this is what I'm supposed to do. And the Douglas character says something like, you know the will of God, you know the mind of God. He says, I know these mountains. Now, I don't know if John Brown really ever said that, but I thought that was a funny little comeback, an interesting thing. But he wanted to destabilize, shake up the whole system.
Yes. He really wanted to bring slavery's operations to a grinding halt. And he felt that would destabilize the country, and it might prompt the South to take some kind of action. But he felt that he could undermine slavery in that way without, as he put it, even in his allocution before the court, and when they found him guilty, he said, I wanted to do that without much bloodshed. Because he knew, in fact, John Brown was a politically very prescient man, and he could see on the horizon the coming of war, because he was very much aware of what the Virginians and others were actually preparing in 1859. They were beginning to move armaments into Southern arsenals. They were beginning to prepare for an escape route from the Union. This was already underway. And he felt that something had to be done that would strike an in-between, a medium between outright civil war and insurrection. And that's what he tried. He failed, of course. But as I always say, nobody else had a plan in 1859 except John Brown. John Brown had boots on the ground, and he tried.
And he was tired of other means and tired of the slow pace. He was an abolitionist, and he wasn't going to wait around any longer. And so that's why I think we should be looking at John Brown as a hero, everyone. And that's why I'm doing this program today. One quick question from the audience. White Lily says, are those myths still believed in the South?
Good. That's a good question. I think in some respects, it's hard for me. I don't want to stereotype the South because, I've met a lot of Southern people who more progressive in some ways than some Northern people are, and so on and so forth. But I would say that in many sections of the South, not only do they still have the myths of John Brown, but they have a very defensive attitude even toward the institution of slavery, that even though they would acknowledge it's not a good thing, they would see lots of ways of qualifying it. I've talked to people from the South who were that way, but I've also talked to people from the South who, to me, they're very much critical of the heritage of the South. So,
yeah, I did a book review once, Douglas Wilson, Southern Slavery as It Was, in which he and his co-author, the thesis of the book is basically slavery wasn't really that bad. There's some outliers and they kind of messed it up, but it wasn't that bad.
Well, from what I know about Doug Wilson, I mean, he's a very tragically, he's a brilliant man and a reformed pastor, if it's the same Doug Wilson.
Yeah.
But he's a real to me, he's a romancer of the Confederacy.
Confederate, that's what he calls himself.
Yeah, paleo is that. Yeah, it's, to me, that's all warm. That's a lot of warmed over stuff. I don't buy it. And to me, you either have to acknowledge that the Confederacy was representing the selfish interest of slaveholders. It was a slaveholders' war. That's what it was. It wasn't, the North imposing upon the South. It was the South had long-term intentions, and to try to romance that, and to try, especially some of our Christian brethren on on the far right who romance the South and try to make the South seem like having the moral high ground. It's most pitiful to me because
Yeah.
what's essentially showing is that they don't have any concern. They don't identify at all with the humanity of Black people at that point, and I wonder whether they have any identification with Black people's sense of things even today. So
Yeah. The Imago Dei is a big issue. And, you look at the kind of Confederate Constitution, it refers to slavery as a cornerstone. I mean, and you look at these things and you say, okay, what are we talking about here? Because there's the modern myth, all these, but we've covered this on a show before. Oh, it was a trade dispute. It's about an embargo. And there's all these lost cause myths. We've dealt with them. This is not our specialty on the show, but I feel like it's relevant. So every now and then we'll tackle it. So let's talk about John Brown's background. He was raised in a Christian home, and we could even say a Calvinist home. Talk about his upbringing.
To be as pointed, he was brought up in, his parents came out of the 1770s in Connecticut. They were evangelicals. I hate to use that term because of the associations, but theologically, they were evangelicals of a Reformed tradition. They were part of the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church spread to the West, along with the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians and the Congregationalists worked together for a period of time in the 19th century. John Brown was reared. He had a Presbyterian pastor in a Congregational church. He was reared on the Westminster Confession of Faith. He became a member of he was baptized, of course, as an infant, as a sign of the covenant theology.
Yeah, they're Paedo-Baptists. You went to a Presbyterian seminary. You went to Westminster.
Who?
Didn't you?
John
Didn't
Brown?
you?
Yeah. Oh, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I saw in your. No, not John Brown. Not John Brown.
Yes. So no, I did a master's at Westminster Seminary. It was a wonderful period of my life, and I value highly the Reformed tradition. And it's interesting because Brown was himself very Bible-based and very Calvinistic. And he definitely was an advocate of what we would call sovereign grace and an advocate of election. He even in his life, he debated Arminians as sometimes for fun. I love my Armenian brethren in urban ministry. Most of my friends and associates, and in my seminary career, most of my associates have been Armenian. So there's no hostility here, but it's kind of fun to know that John Brown was out there battling it out for the 5 points of Calvin. So
it seemed like his favorite was to pick on Methodist ministers, from what I read.
Exactly. That's right.
Another reason why he's a hero.
Yes.
Well, his sons, in some ways, continued some of his legacy in the sense of they were abolitionists, in my understanding, but not all of them remained religiously devoted, right?
Absolutely. That's right. And I think the sad thing is that, in fact, I even know, I know a number of his direct descendants. And I don't think that the evangelical tradition has been very prominent in the family since the 19th century. Some of his descendant cousins, for instance, are. But his children did not embrace the faith, with a few exceptions. His sons, particularly, I don't know if any of the sons embraced their father's religious faith. And this was a point of great concern for him, a point of consternation. He would write about it. He writes more in some ways, he writes more in his letters about that fact than he does about trying. He doesn't need to write about slavery because the whole family is they're quite.
It's a given.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if you read the letters of the sons, some of whom died at Harpers Ferry, but they were all completely so. There was no argument at the family table about whether we're giving too much. The question is, how much more could we give?
And so that's good, And in fact, some of his sons, of course, rode with him on the raid there in Harpers Ferry, and that is a pretty amazing thing, I think. He also was not just a family man, but he did have a lot of famous associates. talk about some of his famous friends. First of all, Frederick Douglass. He stayed in his house for a month, right?
Yeah, very good. Yes, he stayed with Douglass in the beginning of, the end of 1858, the beginning of 1859. He began drafting some of his important documents there for his movement. He and Douglass got to know each other probably about 1847, so they knew each other for about 10 years. My whole reading, in fact, I did a book about Shields Green, one of the Harpers Ferry Raiders. My own sense of Douglass is a little bit disappointed. I'm a little disappointed. My sense of it is that Douglass became much more famous by the time the Harpers Ferry raid rolled around. I believe 10 years before, he was not only he himself says he was more radicalized by Brown.
Right.
But by the time the Harpers Ferry raid came, I think Douglass was much more interested. Yeah, there's the cover. Thank you.
Sorry,
he was
I'll
much
make it
more
smaller.
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go. Yes. He was much more interested, I think, in his own abolitionist role. And I think he was a little put off by the extreme that John Brown was willing to go to. And particularly when Brown told Douglass about seizing the federal armory at Harpers Ferry, he definitely kind of ran. So Douglass actually disappointed Brown, but Brown was not one to complain or talk too much about people. So you can kind of piece that together with a number of points and pieces of evidence.
Basically he was more radical, I guess, if we would use that word, than Douglass. And but they did have a friendship, and it's cool he stayed with him. He also knew Harriet Tubman, and he tried to enlist her in the cause.
Yes, he did, and she was again. There's some gray areas because in 1858 she was very enthusiastic. She had actually had a dream, and she realized later, before she met John Brown, that she had seen him in a dream. This was her belief. Harriet Tubman was a godly woman. A lot of her experiences were more, you might say, along the lines of the charismatic or Pentecostal experience in terms of the Holy Spirit. She was supposed to get men for Brown, but two things happened. He had to lay off the plan. He got set back because of issues that came up. And in that lapse of time, he had to come back. And by the time he got back in 1859, he couldn't be in touch with a lot of other people. I'm also a little suspicious of whether Douglass ran a little interference on Brown toward the end and tried to discourage people from, particularly free blacks, from joining Brown. I can't prove that, but I have suspicions. Not to make Douglass a bad guy. Douglass was a great man. I just think that he and Brown kind of parted the ways before they actually could admit that. It was kind of this bromance that kind of soured a little bit toward the end. But Douglass, of course, made up for it because in his third autobiography, and you know you're important when you write 3 autobiographies, and his third autobiography, he gave John Brown a wonderful, if not somewhat stylized, reminiscence. And whatever we know about the Douglass-Brown relationship, almost all of it comes from Douglass. And so a historian has to be a bit more critical in that regard. But, by the way, Brown knew pretty much all the leading black leadership of the antebellum era.
Sojourner Truth as well?
Well, I think that Mary Brown had some time in a water cure, which was a popular thing with Sojourner Truth, probably. But no, more like I think a lot of it was a lot of the black ministers, Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnett, these are the most prominent black leaders of the antebellum era. He knew them all. They all confided in him. And so he wasn't just connected to the famous ones that we know of, Douglass and Tubman, but he knew pretty much all of them. As a matter of fact, I think, Brown is kind of in between the true traditions in the black community, the integrationist tradition and the black nationalist tradition. And I often think that in some respects, Brown himself was a kind of black nationalist. I think that he was more a black nationalist than he was in the Douglass, down to King kind of stream of integration, like we have a claim to be part of this country, versus the Black nationalist tradition, which is always internationalist and always identifying with Africa. As a matter of fact, I would take the position, following those I've studied under, that the idea of Pan-Africanism really is a later day invention, that Black nationalism in its classic form was international. And I think that Brown was very much hooked in with people like Martin Delany, who were Black nationalists. And I think he supported Black nationalism as it was and in his own time.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone listening would know John Brown was working to establish a provisional government, with its own constitution and everything else. Maybe they'll talk about that, but I want to hold that thought because we talked about his friends. We talked a little bit about his family. And I think this is a good chance, real quick, for a good excuse for me to go to your blog real quick. So I want to show something on the blog here, everybody. This is abolitionist John-Brown.blogspot.com, but it's pretty easy to find. It's Dr. DeCaro's blog, and I went through all of it. I'm not saying I read every word, but I think it goes back all the way to 2005. So this is deep, and there's a whole lot of stuff here, and I just wanted to give you guys. So look at this one. This is an article from 2008. So he's just got all kinds of material here. And that's why I say he is the world's most preeminent scholar on John Brown studies. And if I could just read his words for a second in relationship to his Christian witness, it's pretty cool. I'm going to read this real fast because I need to let Dr. DeCaro speak. I just want to go here and show you guys this. The Evangelical Witness of John Brown. This is from Dr. DeCaro's blog. His conversion and view of the Bible. John had been taught from earliest childhood to fear God and keep his commandments, and though quite skeptical, he had always by turns felt much serious doubt as to his future well-being. About this time became, to some extent, a convert to Christianity and ever after a firm believer in the divine authenticity of the Bible. With this book, he became very familiar and possessed a most unusual memory of its entire contents. And then, look, I want to show a quote here from John Brown, and you can see the source here. I'll highlight the source as I read this, everyone. Just a minute. Let me put it down here. I know I'm partially covering it up, trying to move things around here so you can see everything you need to see. We hope that a life still strengthened may not all be misspent. And again, this is John Brown's words. Everyone understand. I want to emphasize his religious life, as it were. And that the little duty to God and mankind it may yet be in his power to do may be done with his might, and that the Lord Jesus Christ will be the end of the law for righteousness, for that which must be left undone. This is the only hope for us, bankrupts, as we may see at once, if we will but look at our account. So clearly, that's depravity of sinful man and justification by faith. And there's more here. Last thing I want to read, because I don't want to take too much time on this, but there's some beautiful stuff in here. And you can see the headings here with these quotes that are pulled out. Just want to show you real briefly about his children. That God in infinite mercy for Christ's sake may grant to you and wealthy and to my other children eyes to see is the most earnest and constant prayer for your affectionate father, John Brown. He's writing to his children there. Another one here. Would to God all our dear children had the consolation of the Christian religion to support them while the cords that bind them to the earth are broken asunder. I have the saying when they die, I think. I have been drinking of the cup all along and still need it, no doubt. Some beautiful stuff there. So check out his blog. How do they find the blog easily, Dr. DeCaro?
I think if they Google what's the John Brown Today, the blog. It used to be called John Brown Abolitionist, but I retitled it because I also have a podcast. Mm-hmm. So it's John Brown Today, a biographer's blog.
And to everyone, if you look in the description of the show, both the podcast and the blog, the information, the link is right in there. So let's talk about his theology just a little bit more, because to me that's important. When you say Congregationalist, at that time were a lot of Congregationalists Reformed? Because when I think Congregationalist today, I don't think that. But that's his background? Was he an anomaly, or how does that all work out?
Well, the Congregational movement as it existed, let's say coming from England in the colonial period, would have been evangelical by all accounts today in terms of his view of Scripture. And obviously, the only difference really was between the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists was really their view of the church government.
Okay.
In the Congregational system, the congregation kind
More
of rules.
autonomous versus a Presbyterian.
Yeah, exactly. And so, in terms of their theology, yes, in those days they were primarily Reformed, or at least much closer to the Reformation, the English Reformation tradition. The Congregationalists had the Savoy Declaration, which, for all intents and purposes, is not much different from any of the Reformed confessions. That was their view. And so, but of course, they became, in the later 19th century, they became increasingly more liberal. And especially in New England, you have Unitarians, and that influence as well. But in Brown's day, what would be considered today a consistent evangelical position was common, at least more common than we would expect.
Right. So that's his background, and I think that's important to know. We know a little bit about the books that he read, don't we? I understand there was a book sale at one point, and I guess he was familiar with Edwards. I don't know what the evidence for that is, but can you talk a little bit about, in relationship to his theology, what he would have read than how we know relating to his theology?
Well, I understand. It's funny. I've never seen him quote Jonathan Edwards, but first of all, John Brown, and like a lot of the what call educated frontier farmers who were Christians, they read a great deal, more than people read today. They read books, that had multiple journal and newspaper subscriptions. Brown himself probably read a lot of the contemporary as well as some of the classic Reformed. For instance, I don't have any proof that he read Calvin, but I wouldn't doubt that he read Calvin, that he read Edwards. He read some of the other English Puritans as well.
So we do know though.
Yes, and I'm blanking right now, as will happen to me, on some of the, say, 16th or 17th century writers that he read. He liked, and there are two books that he often recommended, and I wish that I could remember the titles, but right now they're blanking, and I do mention them in my religious life of Brown,
which everyone should get.
Thank you. Yes.
This is a great book. Great book.
Yeah. So he was familiar with the Reformed tradition, and certainly I think he would have known Edwards' work. Now it's interesting. I don't know how he felt about Edwards and his view, being a slaveholder. Whether that's one of the reasons why he didn't, because he could be very. I mean, I think he would draw a line in the sand. Now, I don't know if he would be willing to read Edwards and then, kind of, should we say, eat the meat and spit out the bones. But I've never seen one quote of Brown referring to Jonathan.
Church membership? I read a story where he, one church stood up and basically chastised them for compromise and then never joined. Like, what's John's relationship to church membership and pastors in his area?
Well, he was really a member of the Congregational Church until he died. He was a member of the Congregational Church in Hudson, Ohio, where he grew up. I think he transferred it to another, at one point in the 1840s, transferred his membership to another Ohio congregation. But later in life, particularly because of the slavery issue, he got really tired of the conservatism of a lot of the Congregationalists who were, quote unquote, anti-slavery, but were not supportive of an abolitionist position. Toward the end of his life, he went to church when he could. He fellowshiped with people of different denominational backgrounds. He held his own theology close to his chest, I think. As long as they were gospel people, he would be willing to go to churches. For instance, Brethren churches. When he was in the summer before the Harpers Ferry raid, I think he would go to services with some Brethren Anabaptist people. When he was living in the Adirondacks, he helped to start a church that probably was a kind of evangelical mixed bag. He's not a strong denominational guy, but at the same time, he never officially left his denomination. He was a member of a Congregational church until he died. officially.
James G. says, what was his view on SBC at the time, pro-slavery Southern Baptists? Maybe not just specific Southern Baptists. I mean, because I don't know exactly when the split happened, so I'm not trying to get into all that. But I have read numerous places where he had very strong words for compromising ministers. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I like that about him, of course.
Now, he would have no truck with a minister who defended slavery, and that came out when he was held for the better part of 6 weeks as a prisoner in Virginia. He refused to have a pro-slavery pastor pray with him. He absolutely refused.
Basically, even when he was knowing he was being sentenced to death, he refused to meet with the pro-slavery minister. He had some quote where he talked about, I forgot, hypocrisy, charade, sham, something along those lines.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And that kind of argument he carried out, it was probably the only real vociferous. He was actually he became very, as a prisoner, he was visited a lot. A lot of people grew to like him, including the jailers. But when it came to the thing of clergy, it was a sore spot. He just would not. He said, I cannot bend my knee with the pro-slavery pastor. I will not do it. And so, but just as a footnote, he chased a Roman Catholic priest out of the jail as well.
Really?
And I think that was over theology as it was. He was a pro-slavery Roman Catholic priest, but a Roman Catholic priest came to visit him and he shouted and chased the man out.
2 strikes.
Yes, that's right.
Wow. I didn't know that story. That's great. Well, yeah. I like that, he's not willing to compromise with all these pro-slavers, and he wasn't willing to take this, slow path of moderation and all that. He wasn't about that. And I think that's an excellent model.
Yes.
So at one time, last question about the theological elements that I can think of right now, he was studying to be a pastor, but what happened?
Well, he was young. He was a teenager when he went back to Connecticut. His family was from Connecticut, moved to Ohio. He spent a little time in Connecticut trying to get his, he had a one-room schoolhouse, very scanty education, so he had to go back to Connecticut and get some preliminary kind of advanced schooling. He just did not do well. He suffered with inflammation of his eyes. That I don't know really what but it bothered him throughout his life. I think between his struggles with regular kind of academic studies, plus the inflammation of his eyes and economic limitations, he finally gave up and went back to Ohio and never again considered the pastorate. Although he was, kind of a Bible jock. He was a layman, a Sunday school teacher. He even planted churches. Planted Sunday schools. He did that kind of thing. He loved the Word of God. He was able to hold his own in theological debates, in discussions. He fancied himself probably a kind of a practical theologian. But
I think in a lot of ways, of course, he was. And so everyone, I'm trying to bring out today, John Brown is an abolitionist. I think we're understanding that, of course. But not only that, he was a Christian, but a very sort of specific, explicit kind of Christian. It was driving for him. And the essence of his theology, I think, from what I've read, Dr. DeCaro, could be boiled down to this in relationship to the slavery issue. Love your neighbor as yourself. He felt that was sufficient.
Absolutely. He applied, and he said that in a Virginia court that found him guilty in conviction. But he said, he just applied the golden rule. He just could not see how any Christian would want to, keep another person in bondage in light of what the Lord's words were. So it was a very practical, there's not, people say, oh, he's a complicated. I hate when people say John Brown was a complicated. He was not complicated. What's complicated is people who are entangled with racism and entangled with status quo idolatry. They're the ones who make life complicated. John Brown is as single-minded and as simple to understand. He's consistent. He always acts the same. I've studied his life. I collected almost every letter that I think I could find. He acts the same way. He's not perfect. He's a sinner too, and he acknowledges his need of a savior. But he's a very consistent, godly man. But his piety was never separated from his commitment to do, like Harvey Kahn, the the Westminster professor, the late Westminster professor who did missions, he said, one of his books is about the gospel. Evangelicalism is about the gospel, preaching the gospel and doing justice. And that was John Brown. He didn't see how anybody could advance the gospel. In fact, he was a post-millenarian, which is to say he believed
he was post-mill?
Yeah, which was common for 19th century Protestants.
Yeah, I guess it was.
He looked forward and wrote about it in his letter that he anticipated that there would be a worldwide revival. But he essentially said, how can we have a revival if you have slavery? So slavery has to be excised from the spiritual body of the church as much as from the nation if the Holy Spirit is going to work. That was his modus operandi.
I have a book, Puritan Spirits and the Abolitionist Imagination, and understand that John Brown, as my understanding, looked at himself very self-consciously within the Puritan tradition. And I've heard it said that that supposedly his family came over in the Mayflower, but then I think you pointed out they're not in their records. It seems like it was a couple of years after or so. But so he goes back to English stock primarily.
Yes, it is. Now he had some Dutch. Pilgrim on in his family side, but the family line comes from England, and and that the Owens, the names that like are Owen that repeat even in the family line really reflect that English background. There, his genealogy has been traced back to England. And there is some debate. The Mayflower Society does not want to acknowledge John Brown had lineal descent from the Mayflower. But there are those who have argued quite effectively that he was descended from Peter Brown of the Mayflower, who had actually 2 marriages. And so the argument that they make is that Brown was descended from a second marriage. But the Mayflower Society will not have it. They will never acknowledge it. So it's an interesting thing. One thing for sure is the family believed they were Mayflower folks.
Okay, well, maybe it was a different author that said that. I've heard some of the debate. Okay, that's interesting. Well, we're talking about, I think, all the good things. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's get down to the brass tacks, because even now, someone did come in, and I'm not trying to do a whole thing answering just this, but someone came in later and said, but wasn't John Brown a terrorist? So let's talk about specifically, didn't he kill 5 people? And isn't it the case that when he oversaw their deaths, they were hacked to death by a dull, perhaps broadsword? So this happened in Kansas, not part of the Harper Ferry raid, everybody.
Right.
Help us understand. I understand your basic position is he was protecting his family. But didn't he kill 5 people? Was it murder? What was it? Preemptive strike?
Well, of course, God is the judge, and obviously, so my position would be is, first of all, almost everybody runs right to the killings in 1856. They rarely set up the context. The context of Kansas in 1856 is that the pro-slavery side, coming from Missouri, had essentially been bullying and threatening and even killing free state people in the territory, because the territory was coming into the Union, and it was a question of democracy playing the role, the ballot or the bullet. The ballot was supposed to determine whether Kansas came into the territory, into the Union, as a free state or a slave state. And initially, the slave state people, especially Missouri, just cheated and came in. They cheated on the first major election to get a foot up on the free state movement. But the free state settlers were greater in number and started coming in. By the time Brown came out there in the fall of 1855, his sons had already been there. The sons essentially, they're the ones who got him to come out. They said, look, we're in danger here. All we have is a squirrel rifle, and these thugs are coming in. These essentially terrorists are coming in, and they're threatening us. So Brown got a bunch of weapons and went out there. And from the fall of 1855 until the spring of 1856, he lived a normal life. He even went into Missouri and traded with Missourians. But by the spring of 1856, the Brown family, who were notorious for being anti-slavery, black equality people, I have to understand something. it was not a big deal to be anti-slavery. Lots of people were racists and were anti-slavery, like Abe Lincoln. They didn't believe in black equality. They just didn't like slavery. But the Brown family were in a smaller number of people who were radical egalitarians and who believed and wanted to let you know that they believed in black equality. This put them on the radar of the pro-slavery thugs who were invading the territory. And keep in mind, there was no law enforcement to protect them. The federal government in Washington was dominated by pro-slavery interests. The territorial government was dominated by pro-slavery people, and terrorists were not being apprehended, pro-slavery terrorism. And the Brown family and some of their anti-slavery friends in their community were targeted for an assault. And there were 5 people, 5 men, actually 7, but they killed 5 of them, who were acting as agents to bring this onslaught upon them. And instead of waiting and fighting, they decided to take out 5 of these men because they couldn't call the police. They couldn't call the FBI. There was no help for them to appeal to. So you can call it vigilante. I call them anti-terrorism. I think that we have cases in our own contemporary world of attacking terrorists. So when people say he was a terrorist, what they're really doing is excising him out of the context and impugning him for killing when in fact he was the good guy. Terrorists don't believe in inequality. They don't believe in voting. They don't believe in freedom. John Brown did. John Brown didn't go out there to kill people. He went out there to protect his family. And when it became patently clear that his family was in danger, he took action. Now, before the throne of God, God's going to judge him. He himself said, if I committed murder, then God will judge me. He said, but he always felt, the few times he talked about it, that it had to be done. And every one of the family members who participated, because some of his sons and his son-in-law and a couple of other locals participated in this strike, they all felt that it was necessary because they were themselves sparing. They were diverting or throwing off this conspiracy. So I would say that I don't want to say this in an unchristian way, but I'm glad he did what he did because his family really was spared. And even after he did that, the family had to leave Kansas because the pro-slavery terrorism that was there was just so strong. And after he did that, it was better for them to leave, but at least they left with their lives. There's a good chance that because one of his sons actually was murdered later on that summer by, of all people, a Methodist minister. So when you understand what was going on in Kansas at the time, it was undeclared civil war. It was guerrilla warfare. There were no rules of war. There was no help from the federal government. And most of the free state people who went out there did not care about radical abolitionists like the Browns. And at the same time, they had this naive trust that Washington, D.C. was going to help them. And Washington, D.C. was not. And the Browns were like, look, we're going to do what we have to do because at the end of the day, politics becomes personal. Yeah. And so I prefer that he did it, but sometimes I regret it because it's given ammunition to people who really don't even understand it to constantly harp away at this terrorism thing.
Do you agree it should be called the Osawatomie Massacre?
Well, it was certainly, they were killed, they were executed. If you want to call it a massacre, usually denotes a crime. I would say it's a preemptive strike. I would say, was it murder? Well, we see what's going on in the world today. The famous saying, "One man's terrorist is another man's liberator." If you call it a massacre, fine. I'll call it a preemptive strike.
And after that, he became known as Osawatomie John Brown.
Yeah. Osawatomie. Osawatomie is actually the name of a town that is named for the convergence of 2 streams, the Osage River and the Pottawatomie Creek. And the man who founded Osawatomie named it that, and he was kind of associated with Osawatomie, and that became in those days, he was famous. That was the point at which he became famous.
Yeah.
Although admittedly, a lot of people back east did not know what he had done.
Yeah,
They knew
maybe infamous. But one thing I know, the Ethan Hawke miniseries, I know it's fanciful, and I know you had proper gripes about it, but I did love in the beginning when he goes by Osawatomie. I think I'm saying it wrong, but and the pro-slavers are terrified. There's like the scene, I think it's in like a bar or something like that. I can't remember exactly the situation, but I remember like, oh, that's cool. He's got this reputation. The pro-slavers are scared to death. I was like, they should be scared to death for once. That's good.
And I mean, in fact, that was the problem, is that the Free State side was doing all the bleeding until John Brown got there. After John Brown left Kansas, the books were balanced. And unless you're unless you're a philosophical pacifist, I can respect you if you're a pacifist. But if you're not a pacifist, then you should not be handing out these kind of references to John Brown unless you know the real deal. So he was not a terrorist. His whole life was not lived that way. When he went to Virginia, he didn't practice terrorism. John Brown was a counterterrorist, and that's how he should be remembered.
Yeah, I like that. And he did have some battles in Kansas with some Confederate troops as well. This is true. Essentially, his band, his militia versus Confederates.
Yeah, they were Southern troops. They weren't Confederate yet, but they were definitely they were definitely the immediate forerunners of the Confederacy. He did fight them. He fought them in pitched battles in Kansas in the summer of 1856, and won. He won, or at least he escaped. Escaped. So they tried to kill him a number of times. He was, one thing about John Brown that I've seen, that he was himself aware of this. He was a very fearless individual.
Oh yeah.
And one time somebody said about somebody else being, not as bold, and he said, I don't know why I'm this way. I was just born this way. Some people they have a constitution that is much more bold. John Brown was that way, but he also had a theology. He believed that nothing was going to befall him until it was the Lord's time to take him.
That's his Calvinism.
That's his Calvinism, yeah.
Amen.
He was a battlefield Calvinist. He was.
Amen. And I thought it was interesting. You said the closest parallel or mirror image or something along those lines would be Stonewall Jackson on the other side.
On the other side. I mean, you got to admire Stonewall Jackson at one level. He was an extremely godly man. He didn't care what his soldiers thought of him, but he was like Brown in terms of a love for the Lord, a love for scriptures, reformed to the bone.
Oh yeah.
And a man of integrity, except for, unfortunately, he was on the wrong side of an extremely important ethical issue. And, when you have people like that, from Stonewall Jackson to Jonathan Edwards, it's kind of hard to clean them up. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to look at them with admiration when you see that they're slaveholders.
Yep, I agree. It's, to say the least, extremely problematic. So you said people back east may have not known about what happened in Kansas, but they did know about the raid on Harpers Ferry. Yes. Why did he do it? I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but help people kind of understand, because this is it's very defining about John Brown's legacy it's synonymous. John Brown, Harpers Ferry, the raid. Help people understand that better.
Okay, well, as quickly as I can, maybe in bullet points. John, the plan that John Brown had never started. It was supposed to be launched at Harpers Ferry. So the attack on Harpers Ferry was supposed to launch his Southwide liberation, not an insurrection, a Southwide liberation movement. He liked Harpers Ferry, which was kind of a gateway into the South. It was a place where, it was the South, but it was the entrance of the South. There was a federal armory there, but the geography with the rivers and the area was a place he had visited even in the 1840s. His intention was, long-term intention, even going back to the 1840s, maybe even earlier than that, was to start a movement to lead enslaved people into the mountains, the nearby Adirondacks, the Allegheny Mountain system, and to lead them deeper, either as an underground railroad kind of a thing, but also to start a movement to go into the South to liberate more people and build up numbers to throw the whole system of slavery into panic. Not terror, but panic, economic, panic. He identified Harper's Ferry, the armory that was there, and I believe that he did that because when he was in Kansas, the South conducted a raid on a federal arsenal in Missouri and stole the weapons to use them against Free State people in 1856. And the government under Buchanan did nothing about this. They didn't. The Democrats in those years, the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery party. They did not prosecute. They did not pursue this, and this bothered John Brown. So what he did was he wanted to attack the armory, and he wanted to use it as a political statement to kind of poke the government in Washington in the eye and poke the South in the eye and say, well, see, you did it in Missouri, but I'm going to do it here. But what he wanted to do was rally several hundred black people, particularly black men, arm them and move into the mountains nearby and begin his movement. Well, he delayed and he was apprehended. He was defeated. A number of his men were killed and he was arrested, tried, and hanged. So the Harper's Ferry raid was at once a demonstration, and it was a starting point for what he hoped to be a Southwide liberation movement. He did not plan on killing slaveholders. He planned on avoiding slaveholders as much as possible, but leading enslaved people off, giving them some kind of basic arms to protect themselves, working in small groups, and going deep into the South. And as his first biographer, James Redpath, said, he wanted to enact the Declaration of Independence from Virginia down to the Gulf of Mexico. That was his plan, was to destabilize slavery, remove as many enslaved people from slavery as possible, arm them, but elude the slave patrols by staying in the mountains, because you can't fight pitched battles with armies in the mountains. You have to fight in small cadres, and it's very possible to hide. There are many cases in the history of military warfare where guerrilla warfare took place, and the mountains were always a way for guerrilla fighters to elude capture, to fight and carry on a battle that could last for years. That was his plan. That was his plan.
I'm showing, I guess, what is said to be his last stand there at
Yes.
the firehouse, which I guess they call John Brown's fort now. Is that true?
Yes, they call it, exactly. Yes, and it was the fire engine house for the armory works that were there.
And so that's
where he held up his last stand.
An image, and some interesting things happened there. I understand when they burst in the doors, kept on trying to stab him, but he had this big brass belt buckle and it prevented him from dying because they kept on.
Yeah.
They were stabbing him in the brass belt buckle, saved his life.
Yes, and also the man who had by God's grace, the man who attacked him had a costume sword. He didn't have an actual battle saber. If he had, John Brown probably would have been killed. But because of the hurriedness, he went with a costume sword. So when he went in, he had and by the way, John Brown had cried out surrender, but the man wanted to kill him.
Right.
Now, I believe, this is my reading of it, the man tried to stab him with this sword. The sword bent on probably his belt buckle. And then the sword bent double, so he began to beat John Brown with the hilt of the sword until he beat him unconscious. Something else that does not come out in the normal story is at least one other Marine came and they saw John Brown prostrate on the ground and apparently unconscious, and they stabbed him a couple of times with their bayonets. I think to see if he was alive or dead. So when he was a prisoner, he talked about in a number of letters that he was stabbed and he was beaten. As he put it, he was sacked. The man whose I think name was Green, he was a he was a Marine. He really tried to kill, and afterward, according to Jeb Stuart, he was cursing that he could not kill Brown. But of course, again, God is sovereign, and John Brown lived because I think the last part of his life was the most important part of his witness, which was the letters and the testimony. And it was John Brown as a prisoner that essentially proved maybe the biggest weight upon the South. It was his testimony in court, it was his letters. And by the way, whenever he wrote letters, people handed them into the newspaper. And so his letters were published. And so John Brown, we have forgotten because the Civil War kind of covered it over.
Right.
But in 1859, John Brown was one of the most famous people in the world, and certainly one of the most famous Christians of the 19th century. Charles Spurgeon said he lives in our hearts. We love John Brown, and he lives in our hearts. And Charles Spurgeon in England said he would never serve communion to a slaveholder. That's the degree.
In fact, he was threatened. Spurgeon was threatened, and basically, I guess, couldn't go to the South because of that.
Yes, yes. So we have forgotten the importance John Brown represented to the church. And my argument, of course, as a believing scholar and historian is, and I appreciate my friends on the left. The left has loved John Brown, but they have essentially presented the John Brown that is most like their politics. But John Brown was a man of his own kind. He was not a leftist and he was not a conservative. Depends on what the issues were. He was a radical, I would call him a radical Christian reformer.
Yeah, that's
he was
good.
Not a revolutionary. I would say he's not a revolutionary. He doesn't want to destroy the country. He doesn't want to overthrow the United States. He wants to overthrow slavery.
And that's why I got my Charles Spurgeon bobblehead here.
Yeah, but I like that. Nice.
Yeah, because he's a great guy in that way. Yes. And then so Robert E. Lee, out of all people, comes and arrests him. And then
he leads the Marine. Yes.
Yeah, ironic. And then there's this trial, and like you mentioned, he's befriending the guards and all this other kind of stuff, and all that writing. So we got to hear John Brown's voice and at the trial, and that's really the importance of his legacy in so many ways.
Yes, I did a book about the last days of John Brown of Virginia. It's called Freedom's Dawn. But I also did a book called John Brown Speaks, which is a collection of his letters and statements from Charlestown jail. I did it as a kind of an homage to Malcolm X Speaks. So I did this collection of John Brown Speaks. And unfortunately, the publisher just made it too costly. I wish they wouldn't do that. But the point really is that his letters were a witness. But what moved the country, particularly what moved the North, was his evangelical commitment and his willingness, indeed his joy at the idea of dying for this cause. He was happy. He really was happy to die for the cause. He just wanted to bear witness, and that he was able to do. And interestingly, the South should have known better. They were intent on killing him. Virginia, Governor Wise at the time, Henry Wise, was intent on seeing Brown hanged. But for all of his intent on killing John Brown, he wasn't wise, pardon the pun, he wasn't wise enough to keep John Brown's letters from getting out. John Brown radically inflamed the North.
Oh, yeah.
And in that sense, he started the war in the sense that he prepared the nation. And I don't think it's unfair to say that John Brown loomed over the entire nation throughout the Civil War. And, of course, the Battle Hymn of the Republic in its first draft, in its earliest form, was a joke song of soldiers called John Brown's Body, which was not the John Brown, but it was taken up by slaves and by soldiers, and it was sung in honor of John Brown.
His truth goes marching on.
Exactly. And that song was so disturbing even to the liberal element of the abolitionists that they rewrote it into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, because it was embarrassing to them that it was this ditty, and yet somehow it had become full of the power and force of this man's life. And I think it's a good point to say that when you see a true martyr and a true Christian, no matter how humble they are, they can take up the cause that God has given them and turn it into something special. And so the Battle Hymn of the Republic is a beautiful song, but it was actually kind of a right over John Brown's body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Liza smoldering and all that.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
you and I, and obviously you've dedicated decades of your life to this. We want Christians, and I would even say especially evangelical Christians, especially, to have John Brown as a hero, someone they admire. Let's end here. How can we make that happen? How can we make John Brown great again?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I think part of it is, the trouble is when it seems like we have this idea that history is being taught, if history is being taught by the left, or history is being taught the real history, that's kind of the rhetoric you hear in the Christian community. I think we need Christian historians, and we need Christians who are willing to accept the truth as it is, number one. But I think people who are committed to justice and love the Lord and love justice are more open to these things. I find that it's going to be very hard to make John Brown great in the eyes of, because it's it's kind of a zeitgeist. I don't know if we can duplicate what we had at one point. He was a man of the 19th century, and that time is over. And maybe we continue to produce John Browns in various ways. But I think if Christians would just read history, practice the golden rule, and I would say, read Black history and try to understand what the country was to Black people. What was the country to minority, marginalized people? That's a good place to start. John Brown identified with the marginalized. He identified with the enslaved. He identified with the poor. And that's not a liberal thing. That's a gospel thing. Amen. And the trouble is, we've let secular humanists take all the credit for being concerned for humanity. But in fact, the evangelical tradition has enough room in it for people who are against oppression. And I think if we were to reorder our thinking about history, we would find that people like John Brown would be some of our heroes. I really believe that. But I don't know how it's going to be done. I'm in my 60s now. By the way, I retired from the seminary, but I'm in my 60s now, and I no longer have as much confidence that we can change people's minds. But I want to leave the witness of the work, because there are people like Vocab, there are people out there who are Christians that understand what's at stake here. So again, John Brown wasn't a plaster saint. He was a sinner who was saved by grace, but he did something. He tried to do something. And as I say, in 1859, he was the only one who actually had a plan, and he was the only one who tried to carry it out. You show me somebody who tried to end slavery and literally tried to do it. And don't say Lincoln, because Lincoln went into the White House in 1860 on the promise that if the South would support him, he would not end slavery. He would just contain it within its present territories. So
yeah, and he also definitely wasn't egalitarian, everybody should know.
Oh, yeah.
He was basically still a white supremacist,
yes.
Albeit, I guess, if there's a spectrum, he's better than someone else you could name, but I mean, still, seriously. So that's true. Last thing I'm going to do is show this famous image, because somebody wants to see it. This famous image right here. I want to put that on the screen for all to see. It's a great image there. And Bain Mailer actually brought that out. He says, fun fact, the portrait of John Brown by John Stuart Carey can be found in the Kansas City Capitol building in Topeka. He is grasping an open Bible with the Alpha and Omega symbols on the open pages in one hand and a rifle in the other. You can't see it unless you look real close, everyone, but the Greek capital letters Alpha and Omega are on the left, and the right pages there on the top. And it's interesting to look at the background. I love this picture. I mean, I could see you. I wonder if you wouldn't like it, because I know you don't like when people refer to him as a madman, and he does have sort of wild eyes there.
Yes, well, he does. But I mean, we have, I love that picture as well. It's a stylization, obviously, like paintings are, but it carries the message. And the fact that there's a Civil War sense to it shows you that it ties in, that you really can't think of the war. And as I said, when they were fighting the Civil War, John Brown was all in that. And by the time Lincoln was almost at the end of his rope, he actually made inquiries about doing a John Brown kind of raid into the South. He came around to see John Brown too. So I hope that some folks will come around to see that John Brown was not the terrorist. He was the anti-terrorist. He was not the anti-Christian. He was the Christian trying to do the right thing. And
Amen.
at the end of the day, he gave his life. He was willing to die, and that's more than I can say for a lot of us who are not. So
Powerful stuff. Well, maybe for John Brown Day, his birthday, obviously, maybe we could get you back for John Brown Day or something like that. And everyone, look at your calendars, because December 2nd will be the anniversary of when he was hanged and executed.
That's right.
So,
104 years.
John Brown, The Cost of Freedom, one of the books by Dr. DeCaro. Sometime I want to talk about this book too. Great, important work there. And then Fire from the Midst, very unique of you, because it focuses on this element. You see, I got all kinds. These are all the bookmark places here, or the places I said, we need to talk about that. Yeah. So a lot of great material. And everyone definitely check out the podcast, John Brown Today, and check out the blog as well. And whatever else you can find from Dr. DeCaro, I think you'll appreciate it. If you have a subscription to Christianity Today, he's got a great article he did a year ago, Why White Evangelicals Should Claim John Brown. And I agree wholeheartedly, 100%. So I'm going to be pushing him as long as I can. So I do hope we can talk again.
Yeah, anytime. I'm happy to I'll be happy to come back on and talk to you, and happy to talk about these matters with you.
Awesome.
So
thank you
for the invitation.
Yes, sir. And thank you, Andrew Graham, for today's Super Chat. Everyone, we're going to go. I'm not going to do a live tomorrow, but we are going to have a premiere. And then Friday, we are going to do a live. So see you in a few days live, but channel will be active tomorrow. So maybe see you in the live chat. Happy Thanksgiving. God bless. Peace out, everyone. Have a great day.